Well, good afternoon. This is something different. I'm using Zoom actually today to record this. So if the picture quality is not spectacular, I apologize in advance because I want to be able to share with you some examples, and I want to do more of this as we go forward in the semester, and as we work on other paper topics. So my goal is to show you sample papers, things that work, things that don't work. As you start working on your own papers or as you're finishing them off. So today what I'm going to do is I'm going to share with you some examples that I hope will help with paper number 2, the Susan Sontag essay, as you're reading it and then writing your response to it. So let me share with you, first of all, just some details on the directions themselves for this essay, especially as you're working on it and as you're trying to finish it up. So let me do my screen share here, and I want to show you some of the key elements on the directions themselves. So if you have your directions in front of you, or if you'd like to take a look at them, again, please make sure, as I said in a previous video, that you spend some time looking through the directions. I know that maybe they're a little bit longer than you'd care for them to be, or maybe they're a little bit longer than you've had in other writing classes, but I think it's important to really focus on the main components of any paper like this. And so what I always try to do, as I've said before, is I try to go through with you as much as I can in the directions, all the things that you need for the paper. So for this one, here's all the basic elements, right? So for this essay, we know that we need to have at least 5 or 6 paragraphs. And that's why I always open up these directions by saying that the paper has to have the thesis statement. I'll talk about that more in a second. It's got to have the supporting body paragraphs, and it has to have a conclusion, so that you know, as you're writing this, those are the basic elements that are necessary for the paper. I mentioned that you obviously can use first person for this, and I mentioned that because I do have students occasionally that will say, "Well, excuse me, do I, is it okay for me to use first person with this particular assignment?" And I say, of course, because particularly with this one, you're giving your opinion on Sontag. And if you're doing numbers 1 or 2, you're also using photographs that come from your family or from your friends. So you would have to use first person. And I say be formal in the sense of not using, words or language that you'd use in a text, for example, or in a really informal email. It's still an essay that I'm reading. It's still a college paper, but it's okay to use first person. And again, you have to do it for this one, particularly because it is a opinion-based paper. Now, I mentioned here that you need at least 2 quotations from Susan Sontag. So those are the ones, again, that would correspond to whichever part of the essay it is that you're focusing on. So if you're focusing on part 1 and the family photos, then your quotations would be coming from the first 2 pages of the article that I gave you, which means that would come from pages 8 onto the top of page 9. Okay, if you're looking at topic number 2 on the vacation photos, then you're looking at the bottom of page 9 and the top of page 10. And then lastly, for the news photo topic, you'd be looking at pages 11 and onto the top of page 12. So with this assignment, I'm trying to keep the reading very concentrated and compact so that way you can adjust to using quotations from it, particularly if it's been a while since you've used quotations from a source like this. It also allows you to focus on the really important ideas in her article that you can then respond to. So again, it's 2 direct quotations. That's always a minimum. So whenever I mention a bit of directions like that, you can certainly use more than that if you want to, but that's the minimum. This is pretty standard, and most of you did fine with this with paper number 1. This should be double spaced, and it should have Times New Roman 12-point font with 1-inch margins, which is standard format for most of the papers that you're going to write in college. Now, lastly, this is really significant. Do not use any other essays or online sources to write about this topic. It's you and Susan Sontag's article, so you're responding directly to her. I don't need a biography of Susan Sontag. I don't want you going online and looking up other essays about Sontag or about her articles. That gets into some really slippery territory, because when you start doing that, what happens is not only are you not expressing your ideas and your opinions, which is the point of any of these essays, but you also run the risk of plagiarizing, which means if you're looking up sources and you're not citing them and you're trying to incorporate them into your paper, for expediency's sake, for just to get the thing done, don't do that. If you're having trouble with the paper, as I've said before, please contact me. send me an email. You set up a Zoom one-on-one appointment with me, and I'm happy to help in any way that I can. But don't go down the path of trying to use other sources, because you will not end up doing well on the paper. And in most cases, what I'm going to have to do is fail you for it, because again, it goes against the directions. And that's why you'll notice for these papers, particularly the more we start using quotations in them, I always have a stipulation like that explaining exactly what sources to use and what sources not to use. So keep that in mind, and I'll give you another example of that in a minute. Now, the prompts, I've gone through those in the other videos that I've posted. I've gone through some of the elements of the paper. As I said with the first essay, the prompts are really designed also to help you map out the essay. If you read over the prompt carefully, it's going to give you some of the main ideas that you can pursue as you're writing. So I would recommend looking back at my other videos for the Sontag essay, for parts 1, 2, and 3 of it that I posted last week, and review those, because those will help you also think about these topics. Maybe also take a look at the quiz that you completed last week, which encouraged you to get started in thinking about some of these ideas. Now, at the end of all my direction sheets, you'll notice that I always put on a reminder about MLA citation format. So this is a guide that I hope will help you with all of the papers. I modify it slightly depending on the assignment that we're doing. But what you'll notice is that in this section of the directions, and this was also there for paper number 1, even though it was really only a handful of you that used citations in that first paper, because again, it wasn't necessary and it wasn't absolutely required. But that was the case with the first paper. Every other essay we write for the class will be a lot like this one, where you're going to be using these quotations and responding to them and citing them correctly. So I've given you a sample paragraph here. A couple of things to note about this, and I may have mentioned this to you in your first paper if you did use something from Morrison or you did quote something from Rose, is that you want to introduce the quotation. So that means in a solid paragraph that incorporates a quotation effectively, you want to lead up to it. You really don't want to start the paragraph off with a quotation, and you don't want to end with one either. That's a bit of advice I got from one of my high school teachers years and years ago, and it served me pretty well, because again, the quotations are supposed to be embedded in the body of the paragraph, particularly in the middle of the essay. So if you take a look at this little sample paragraph, I'll read a little bit of it to you. In her essay on photography, and you'll notice there too, by the way, in MLA format, we do put the commas and we do put periods within quotation marks. So if you saw me correcting that with paper number 1, that's why I was doing it. That's standard format. There's variations on that around the world. In the UK, for example, they do put their commas outside of quotation marks, but in the US, in MLA format, that's how we do it. So if you see me correcting that, that's why. Anyway, in her essay on photography, Susan Sontag begins with a discussion of what she describes as the magical qualities of still images. Although she wrote this essay in the 1970s, many of the points she makes are still relevant today in the age of digital cameras and smartphones. According to Sontag, comma, quotation, photographs are perhaps the most mysterious of all the objects that make up and thicken the environment we recognize as modern. And you'll notice here, after the quotation, you've got the name of the author, you have the page number. Now in this one, I'm using a quotation from another portion of Sontag's book, which is why it's 174 and not pages 8, 9, 10, or 11. And then the period comes at the end of it. So anytime you have a source that has page numbers, it's a book source. If it's a digital source that was scanned from a book source, like the article or the portion of the book that you're using for this paper, then you still use the page numbers, okay? And it's very simple. The period comes at the end of the sentence. There is no other period here at the end of the quotation itself. So this is all done correctly. So let me highlight that just so you can see how the citation format works in MLA, Modern Language Association format. And you'll notice also that the quotation's in the middle of the paragraph, okay? And then after that, I won't read this, but you can read it on your own. The next section of it is your discussion of the quotation. So the way to think of this is something that my colleague, Meg King, who's another faculty member in the English department at Harper, she describes this as being almost like a sandwich. And that's the way you can really think about your paragraphs. Maybe that's a nice way to think about it, you know, as a kind of very hearty sandwich that you're making. And so typically what you want to do is to have something that looks like this. You have some introductory sentences in the very middle. you have your quotation with the correct citation, and then the final sentences of a paragraph like this are the ones where you give your opinion, you give some analysis, you give some discussion of the quotation that you're using. So again, my friend Meg in our department calls this the sandwich method, which I think is great because that is a very standard way to set up a paragraph like this, particularly for a paper. Again, not just for English, but for any class you have where you're being asked to use sources. You want to cite them correctly, you want to cite them carefully, and you want to embed them. So in other words, you want to give yourself time and space to also give some commentary on the pieces that you're using. So again, here, if you notice it, we have this introductory material, which again, if we thought of this as a sandwich, that's the top piece of bread. We get the middle, which I'm vegetarian, so I guess we could say there's some tofu or some kind of mushrooms here. I actually don't like mushrooms. Let's just say it's a tofu sandwich. Maybe a tofurkey or something, a veggie burger in the middle. And then at the bottom is your other piece of bread, right? So that's how the paragraph should look. Everything I've just said, by the way, I summarize here. So in this next part of the directions, this reminder, and I'll highlight this maybe in a different color, you'll see that that's an explanation of what I just walked you through, quoting the source, discussing it, and then citing it correctly. Now, for this paper, you do need to have a works cited. If you're doing topics number 1 and 2, the works cited that will appear after your last paragraph on the paper would look like this. You can cut and paste this if you'd like to into your paper. We're only using one source for this. It's Sontag Susan, so her last name and first name, the name of the book source, which in this case is also called On Photography. That's where I got the little article from. The name of the publisher, comma, and then the day or the year it was published. Okay, 1977. So again, you're welcome to include that and cut and paste it into your paper if you're doing topics 1 or 2. If you're doing 3, as I mentioned here, you do need to include a reference or a citation for the news article that you got it from. And so the sample that I put on here when I wrote this up or revised this assignment a couple of weeks ago is from an article that I read in the New York Times in second week of September that I enjoyed. And so this is a reference to this particular photograph. So if I were doing topic 3, and now we're writing about these Belarusian musicians who are trying to kind of come back and make their music again after a lot of political oppression in Belarus. That's what this article is about. If I clicked on this, you'll notice it's going to take me directly to the source itself. So that's a great citation. So again, if I were writing this paper and I were writing about this musician, Pit Paula in Belarus, then I would need that citation at the end of it. So let me go back to the actual sheet itself. That's what that's in there for. So when you're using an electronic source like that, that has, in this case, a photographer, that was the name of the photographer. And if I go back to the source itself, you'll see where I got all that information from. It's right here. So pretty easy to find. Oh, sorry about that. I guess my dictionary is opening. But I've got the name of the photographer, and then instead of a title, I use the caption of the photo. So if I go back to my works cited, that's where all that information came from. Here's the name of the photographer, which was at the bottom of the photo. This is the actual name of the photo or the caption for it. And then after that, you put the source. Where is it from? If it has a date, then you also include that. In our case, we got lucky with this one. We do have the date right here after the name of the author of the article itself. And then again, we just have the URL, so the address, which allows the reader then to click back on the article so they can read it for themselves. And then the access date is basically the day that you read it, okay, the day that you opened it. So the reason that's included is that occasionally, as you probably know, some online sources eventually disappear if the website doesn't last, or if someone doesn't pay their web fees for the website. I've actually had that happen to me occasionally with a couple of articles where I had drafted the article 1 year and then a year later the website perhaps was gone or had been modified in some way. And so that's what the access date is showing. It's showing the date that you accessed it, which means that at that point, that's what was found on the website. So really, like I said, any date that you looked at it, you would include at the very end. And again, if you have questions on this, please let me know and I'll be happy to answer them for you, okay? So that's some detail on the directions themselves. Again, I always hope that they help, and I hope that they're useful as you're working through these papers and developing your ideas. Now, briefly, I want to show you a couple of things that you should avoid with this essay. And I'm going to use an example not from Susan Sontag, but from our last essay, Mike Rose. So let me show you a paragraph here that I want to talk about briefly. And let me do my screen share again, and I'll show you here what I have. So if I go to my sample paragraphs, I have one here that I want to show you. This is not from any students in our class. This is actually based on some papers I received maybe last year, year before. Again, sometimes I keep sample paragraphs from student papers so that I can use them. Sometimes I modify them so that I can use them in class. So let's imagine for a second that this was a paragraph that that a student had included in their paper. And actually, let me double space it for you too here so that you can kind of see it better on your screen. So I'm going here to my, my double spacing function. If you've had any trouble double spacing in Word, you're getting a crash course on how to do it. So let me read this to you, and let me identify what the problem is, and let me urge you not to do this, because this is a major problem. It's something that I would ask you to avoid, because it produces a host of other issues when this happens. So let me read this. In his essay, Blue Collar Brilliance, Mike Rose writes in detail about the work that his mother and his uncle did. Rose tries to show that all forms of work should be respected in the same way. For example, his mother worked as a waitress in several restaurants, but in order to do well at her job, she needed to develop what Rose calls many cognitive skills. Rose argues against the need for a formal education by giving these examples of his own family, mainly his mother and his uncle. For example, he states that many often closely associate intelligence with traditional schooling, even though there are many examples of people that drop out of school and still live, quote, successful lives. While some of Rose's points are well supported and agreeable, his overall argument for the dismissal of general education is, in my view, incorrect and should not be applied in the education system. Now, you may read that and say, well, that looks pretty good. The sentences are correct. There's good grammar, I guess. The style is okay. But if you take a closer look at this, if I read a paper and I see this for paper number 1, the alarm bells are going to go off for me, because part of the issue with this paragraph is that, number 1, it's off topic. Again, if you go back and you think about paper number 1, it really didn't ask for an analysis of Rose. It asked for the student's own experience of a job and the skills needed for that particular job. So in this case, what's happened is, as you read through it, particularly starting with about this section, let me highlight this for you. Actually, let me do it from here. If you take a look at this, this whole section, Rose argues against the need for formal education. Unfortunately, what happened here, and I have it here up on my screen, is that this sample was plagiarized from this website. This site that's called Cram, which, again, if a website is called Cram, it is not a legitimate academic source. So clearly, if you see that, there's going to be a problem here. But sadly, over the years, I will get students that will, maybe out of fear or out of rushing or just wanting to get the assignment done and not wanting to put a lot of time into it, their first instinct will be to look up other material on the particular source or reading that they're using. That's not something you should do. And again, please avoid that. Please don't do that, because plagiarism results in an F, and it's a serious issue. It's something that should be avoided. Now, in this particular case, if you read this, Mike Rose argues against the need for formal education by giving examples of his own family, etc. This particular sample paragraph is identical, right? So someone went in, they did a little cut and paste here, and they included this particular paragraph in their own. So if I see a paper like this, it has to be an F. It's uncited sources. Uncited sources that were not included, that were not even necessary for the paper, because again, for that first assignment, all that was required was to tell about your own job. So please don't do that. If you're struggling with a paper, email me. I'll be happy to give you suggestions. I'll be happy to help as much as I can. Even if you think you have no way that you're going to be able to complete it, trust me, I can help you, and I'll be able to give you suggestions, and we can work through it together. And I'm happy to do that. That's my job. But don't do this. If you have something like this where you put in sources that are not cited from some other place like this, not only is it easy to find, because again, I'm reading these all electronically, so I have a program that will analyze them even if I don't recognize the the use of outside sources, but typically I can figure it out pretty quickly because I've been at this for a long time. But the problem with this is I will give you the F for the paper if I see this. So because it's one thing to make mistakes with citations. If you're trying your best and you're citing correctly, that's not a problem. But don't go online looking up other material on the papers or on the essays that we're reading in order to bolster or add details to your assignment or to make it longer, because I'm going to have to give it an F and inevitably I'm going to find it. So I'd encourage you not to do that. And the time it's going to take you to like look something up online and try to find all these analyses, most of which are not very good to begin with, you can just send me an email and I'll be happy to help you out. So let me show you the opposite of this. Let me get away from this topic and show you something a little bit more encouraging that's related directly to our assignment. I have some sample papers that I kept from last year that were excellent. And I want to show you one from last September around the same time. So as you can see, these students were working on this topic around the same time that you're working on it this semester. And this is a student I had last fall who did a very nice job, but I found her early draft of her paper. So I just want to show you some basic elements of this. I'm not going to walk through the whole paper. I also don't post sample essays like this anymore. Speaking of plagiarism, this is actually kind of a terrible story. But about 10 years ago or so, almost 10 years ago, I was teaching an English 101. No, 101. It was an English 102 class. It was a summer class, which I don't teach very often. I usually do my own writing over the summer, but I was teaching a class. I posted a sample paper, and I had never seen this before. At that point, I'd already been teaching for almost 15 years, 12 or 15 years. And someone actually plagiarized the sample paper. So after that, I never posted any more sample papers on Blackboard. I think I was so scarred by the experience that I chose not to do that. I also don't like to post sample papers because I think it makes people believe they have to copy it exactly, which is perhaps why that plagiarism incident took place. At any rate, I'm just going to show you this here just to give you some idea of how this student last year in my English 101 class got a start on this paper. And again, this was an earlier draft, so she had things that she added. You'll even see some of my notes here in the margins, but I'm just going to show you her intro. And I'm also going to just show you a couple of the body sections of the paper really briefly, just to give you an idea of how to approach this essay. You also may see that it's not as complicated as it might seem to be. If you read the directions or you read the Sontag essay and you thought to yourself, wow, this looks really complicated. How am I going to do this? It's actually a fairly streamlined assignment. Sontag is not the easiest writer necessarily to respond to, but once you get her basic ideas down, and it seems like a lot of you are in the emails that I'm getting, you'll be fine. You just got to take your time with it. That would be my other suggestion when you're working on essays like this, is try to start them as soon as you can. As soon as you've read the essay, start taking notes. The further we get into the semester, the more time you can give yourself in the 2 weeks that I give you to work on the essays, the better off you're going to be, because take it slowly. If you're trying to write with just a couple of days left before the assignments due, again, that works for some people. It never worked for me personally. When I was an undergraduate, I always needed to use the full 2 weeks when I was writing these assignments. So try the best you can to start them earlier, because the earlier you start, even if it's just writing a couple of paragraphs, the earlier you can ask me questions, and I'm better able then to get back to you with comments, or we can do a Zoom meeting, whatever's going to help. But let me just show you this opening, and then I'm going to show you a couple of transition sentences here, maybe just to kind of help things along. This student chose to do topic 1. So this is the family paper, or the family photos paper, I should say. And so she's responding to that aspect of Sontag. Here's how she started her essay, or the draft of her essay last year. Family is very important to me, especially my relationship with my grandparents. The photograph that I've chosen to take a closer look at shows my grandfather around loved ones at his 50th birthday party. Within this past year, I've lost my grandfather to a battle with his dementia. Photographs can be the only thing we have left to remember the ones that we loved. This is true because all I have left of my grandfather are memories, along with the pictures to remember him by. Susan Sontag goes into detail about how family photos are cherished and never forgotten. I agree with her because the only way that I can remember my grandfather is by looking at the photographs of him and reminiscing on all the great adventures that we had together. So I'll type in a little correction there. So you'll see here that this is a fairly simple introduction, and she hits all the major points. She tells me what kind of photo she's going to talk about, which is the very first part of the paragraph, right? She gives a little preview of Sontag's ideas before she actually mentions and cites Sontag here, where she talks about why family photographs are so significant. And then before she gets to the very end, where she mentions whether she agrees or disagrees with her, in this case, she agrees with Sontag, she mentions Sontag herself. And you'll notice she uses her full name here. I have a little note here saying that she probably also should introduce the name of the reading. So you could write in something like this, on photography. And I'm going to put it in quotation marks because I only gave you a portion of the full book. I didn't actually give you the whole the whole book to read. That would have taken us a while to get through. But that's a good way to introduce what it is you're writing about. So you not only do you have the name of the author, but you've also got the name of the essay or the book that you might be writing about. Now, from there, she goes into her summary. Now, I'm not going to spend time reading this, but you know, as I go through this, what I remember in reading this draft is that she embeds the citation. So she's got Sontag in the middle here. She's purely basing her ideas on what she read. And you'll notice as I kind of slowly skim through this, the first two body paragraphs are her analysis and discussion of Sontag, right? And I mentioned even in my note here that I thought she had a good summary of this. So she's citing everything correctly. She's embedding the sentences and the quotations as best she can. Again, you don't have to be a master or an expert on Sontag to do this. I'm just asking you to give me your best summary and response to Sontag, but I want to know your opinion. Okay, that's what's really critical in this essay. I don't want the opinion of some other person online. I don't want the opinion of some other critic who wrote about Sontag. I want to know what you thought about it. And if you're having a hard time formulating your ideas on what you thought, send me an email. We can talk about it together. Hopefully I can give you some ideas. But in this case, again, she's got these two full paragraphs where she uses her quotations. In fact, she has three quotations here that she used from the essay. And then as she gets to the second half of the paper, if you look at where I am on Word here, I'm already on pages 2 of 4. So I'm heading to the middle of the essay, and now she starts describing the photograph. Especially her memories that are triggered by the photo. And she has three, actually. Again, in your paper, I would try to have at least 2 paragraphs on the photo. Sometimes some students will have one longer paragraph that works. That's a very individual thing, so it really would depend on what you're writing about. But as you get to the end of the essay, you'll notice in this draft that the student had, this was her weakest part. So this was something in my notes here that I said, the details and structure in the rest of this paper are great, but since Sontag is so much a part of the essay, especially in the first half, and I'm reading my note over here, please include some reflections here at the end about how reading Sontag has given you a new, different, or even more complex understanding of why family photos are meaningful. So you'll notice in my comment here, what I tried to do was encourage her to give me more of her opinion, because this was not quite there yet. She did get to her 3 pages, so she was at the end of page 3, so she had plenty of details in the body of the paper, but we needed a stronger ending in this draft. I'll have to take a look through my files to see if I do have her final paper, or maybe I can contact this student. I'm still in touch with her, and she, I remember, did a very good job about ending this. But that's one other thing to kind of keep in mind as you're writing these, is if you have a really strong rest of the paper where, again, you've introduced things, you've had 2 paragraphs of summary in response to Sontag, all of which is cited correctly, and you're using your ideas, you're not pulling in uncited sources from online, then you've got your 2 paragraphs, at least, hopefully, of some discussion of the photo, 1 or 2, and then your ending. But the ending should be as strong as the rest of this, and that's what I tried to encourage this student to do. If she had turned this paper in as is, without that final paragraph, probably be a B. It'd be in the B range, because the rest of it's pretty strong. But the ending here was not quite developed yet, which again is why she sent me the draft. She said, can you please take a look at the ending? Can you please take a look at the opening and tell me what I can do to fix it? As I said, if I can find the final version of this, maybe I can show you that ending, or I'll get in touch with my my former student here and see if she still has a copy that I can share with you. But let me go back to my screen here. Those are just some suggestions that I have for you that I hope will help. And another thing to keep in mind is that every paper we do after this one, paper 3, paper 4, into paper 5, and even in our midterm revision, for example, we're going to be using sources like this. So this is a practice run. So to sum up, what I need you to do in this paper is, again, do the best you can. Make sure it's your work. So again, you don't need other outside sources for this. You have good ideas, you have good opinions. You're all smart students. I've seen plenty of your work already to know that. So you can do this. Even if you need a little extra help from me, I think you'll be fine. Again, it's a fairly straightforward topic, even though Sontag's ideas, maybe seem a little complex when you first encounter them. But think about this. Again, that's the basic structure of the paper. Just do your best to kind of fill in all those different components. It is kind of like a formula. You fill in the intro, you fill in the summary of Sontag, you do your analysis of your photo and a discussion of your photo, and then you sum up your ideas at the end with a balance of maybe final reflections on your photo and then some final reflections on Sontag herself. You're going to see when we get to the next paper, paper number 3, that we're going to do the same structure. We're going to have an outside reading. Actually, in that case, you'll have a couple to choose from, and then you'll be able to respond to that reading with some opinions and ideas and analysis of your own. So from here to the end of the semester, this is the basic format we're going to use. We're going to use citations for all the papers, and we're also going to incorporate these different ideas from our sources. So again, it's practice. Just take your time with it. Be patient. Please reach out to me if you need help, and I'll be happy to give you suggestions, and I'll be happy to read drafts. Okay? So if you have any other questions, like I said, send along a message to me. I'll be happy to talk with you. And in the next video, I'll talk about some other editing things that may come up, just basic sentence level things that I'll show you another sample paper that we can take a look at. Again, these are normally things I do in class on the whiteboard in front of us, but with the images projected behind us of the paper. But hopefully this use of Zoom may help as you're going through and thinking about finishing up this paper. Okay, so I'll talk to you later. Again, send me your draft if you'd like me to take a look.